Welcome dear learners, I am Dr. Sylvia, Associate Professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition. In the previous module, we have discussed the mechanism of respiration. This module, describing the role of lungs in gaseous exchange, is a part of the paper on human physiology. It describes the pulmonary and systemic aspects of the exchange of respiratory gases. It will enable you to define and comprehend the different phases with the exchange of respiratory gases, explain the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide, describe the exchange of gases at tissue level, and explain the terms respiratory exchange ratio and respiratory quotient. From the earlier modules, I am sure that you have understood that the lungs are the main organs that facilitate exchange of respiratory gases between the alveoli and the blood. The respiratory unit is the structure through which the actual exchange takes place. The lungs are a part of the breathing system which is adapted for two functions, namely ventilation, the movement of air into and out of the lungs, and gas exchange or the swapping of gases between the alveolar air and the blood. As in the diagram, the lungs are located within the upper part of the body called the thorax. They are surrounded by the rib cage which protects them, and in between the ribs are the intercostal muscles which play a role in ventilating the lungs. Beneath the lungs is a muscular sheet called the diaphragm. This separates the lungs from the abdomen and also plays a role in ventilating the lungs. Oxygen is supplied continuously and carbon dioxide is removed regularly through a specialized exchange surface in the respiratory system. The efficiency of this system is further improved by the ventilation of exchange surface and by having an efficient blood supply, both of which maintain a suitable concentration gradient. Within the lungs is a network of tubes through which air is able to pass. Air is firstly warmed, moistened and filtered as it travels through the mouth and nasal passages. It is then passed through the trachea and down one of the two bronchi and into one of the lungs. After traveling into the many bronchioles, it finally passes into some of the millions of tiny sacs which are called the alveoli. The alveoli have the specialized surfaces for gas exchange. In this module, we will study about the actual process of gas exchange. Let us try to define the term gas exchange. What is gas exchange? By definition, gas exchange is a biological process through which different gases are transferred in opposite directions across a specialized respiratory surface. The gases are constantly required by and produced as a byproduct of cellular and metabolic reactions, so that an efficient system for their exchange is important. It is linked with respiration in animals and both respiration and photosynthesis in plants. From your knowledge in school, you might recall that in respiration, oxygen is required to enter cells while waste carbon dioxide must be removed. The opposite process occurs in photosynthesis, that is, carbon dioxide enters plants and oxygen is released. Thus, the exchange of gases essentially occurs as a result of diffusion down a concentration gradient, that is, the gas molecules move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. The primary function of the respiratory system is to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Inhaled oxygen enters the lungs and reaches the alveolus. The respiratory membrane of the layers of cells lining the alveoli and the surrounding capillaries are each only one cell thick and are in very close contact with each other. This barrier between the air and blood averages about 1 micron. Now, how much is 1 micron? 1 micron is 1 by 10,000 of a centimeter or 0.00039 inches in thickness. In the respiratory unit, oxygen passes quickly through this microspace of air-blood barrier into the blood in the capillaries. Similarly, carbon dioxide passes from the blood into the alveoli and is then exhaled, as you can see in the figure. Oxygenated blood travels from the lungs through the pulmonary veins and into the left side of the heart, which pumps the blood to the rest of the body. Oxygen deficient, carbon dioxide rich blood returns to the right side of the heart through the two large veins, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Then the blood is pumped through the pulmonary artery into the lungs, where it picks up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. Within the alveoli, an exchange of gases takes place between the gases inside the alveoli and the blood. Blood in the alveoli has a higher carbon dioxide concentration, which is produced during respiration by the body cells. However, the air in the alveoli has a much lower concentration of carbon dioxide, meaning there is a concentration gradient which allows carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the blood and into the alveolar air. Similarly, blood arriving in the alveoli has a lower oxygen concentration, while the air in the alveoli has a higher oxygen concentration. Therefore, oxygen moves into the blood by diffusion and combines with the hemoglobin in red blood cells to form oxyhemoglobin. Before we move into the details, let us discuss the composition of the inhaled and exhaled air. The table here shows that both inhaled and exhaled air contain oxygen, carbon dioxide and nitrogen. The composition of nitrogen is the same in inhaled and exhaled air, that is 79%, whereas oxygen is higher in inhaled air 21% than in exhaled air, which is 16%, and carbon dioxide is higher in exhaled air 4% than in inhaled air, which is 0.04%. Let us now discuss how the alveoli are adapted to facilitate maximal gas exchange. To maximize the efficiency of gas exchange, the alveoli are folded, providing a much greater surface area for gas exchange to occur. As we already know, the walls of the alveoli are only one cell thick. This makes the exchange surface very thin, shortening the diffusion distance across which the gases have to move. Each alveolus is surrounded by blood capillaries, which ensure a good blood supply. This is important as the blood is constantly taking oxygen away and bringing in more carbon dioxide, which helps to maintain the maximum concentration gradient between blood and air in the alveoli. Each alveolus is ventilated, removing waste carbon dioxide and replenishing oxygen levels in the alveolar air. This also helps to maintain the maximum concentration gradient between the blood and the air in the alveoli. Now, let us trace the events in the actual gas exchange between alveoli and capillaries. About 5 to 8 liters of air per minute are brought in and out of the lungs, and about 3/10 of a liter of oxygen is transferred from the alveoli to the blood each minute, even when the person is at rest. At the same time, a similar volume of carbon dioxide moves from the blood to the alveoli and is exhaled. During exercise, it is possible to breathe in and out more than 100 liters of air per minute and extract 3 liters of oxygen from this air per minute. The rate at which oxygen is used by the body is the measure of the rate of energy expended by the body. Breathing in and out is accomplished by respiratory muscles. The function of the respiratory system is to exchange the two gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. This exchange takes place in the millions of alveoli in the lungs and the capillaries which envelop them. As shown below, the inhaled oxygen moves from the alveoli to the blood in the capillaries, and carbon dioxide moves from the blood in the capillaries to the air in the alveoli. Three processes are essential for the transfer of oxygen from the outside air to the blood flowing through the lungs. These processes are ventilation, diffusion, and perfusion. Ventilation is the process by which air moves in and out of the lungs. Diffusion is the spontaneous movement of gases without the use of any energy or effort by the body between the gas in the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries in the lungs. Perfusion is the process by which the cardiovascular system pumps blood throughout the cells. To recapitulate the events in respiration, air first enters the body through the mouth or nose quickly, moves into the pharynx, passes through the larynx, enters the trachea, which branch into the right and the left bronchus within the lungs, and further divides into smaller and smaller branches called bronchioles. The smallest bronchioles end in tiny air sacs called alveoli, which inflate during inhalation and deflate during exhalation. Gas exchange is the delivery of oxygen from the lungs to the bloodstream and the elimination of carbon dioxide from the bloodstream to the lungs. It occurs in the lungs between the alveoli and the network of tiny blood vessels called capillaries, which are located in the walls of the alveoli. The walls of the alveoli actually share a membrane with the capillaries in which oxygen and carbon dioxide move freely between the respiratory system and the bloodstream. Oxygen molecules attach to red blood cells which travel back to the heart. At the same time, the carbon dioxide molecules in the alveoli are blown out of the body within the next exhalation. Now, let us move into the respiratory unit about which we have dealt with in module 17. As you observe in the diagram, the respiratory unit consists of the terminal bronchiole, alveolar sacs, ducts, antrum, and the alveoli. The actual gaseous exchange takes place through the respiratory membrane. The membrane through which the exchange of respiratory gases occurs is called the respiratory membrane and forms the blood-gas interface which separates blood in the pulmonary capillaries from gas in the alveoli. The membrane is formed by the epithelium of the respiratory unit and the endothelium of pulmonary capillaries. Diffusion of gases between alveolar air and pulmonary capillary blood takes place through this membrane. It is exceedingly thin and composed of alveolar epithelium, interstitial fluid layer, and capillary endothelium. As the blood perfuses the alveolar capillaries and air ventilates the alveoli, oxygen and carbon dioxide move across the blood-gas interface by diffusion. Next, we move on to the structure of the respiratory membrane. The epithelium of the respiratory unit is very thin. The capillaries are in close proximity with this membrane and the alveolar gases to the capillary blood. This facilitates the easy exchange of gases between air and blood. The respiratory membrane is formed by different layers of structures of the alveoli and capillaries. From the alveolus to capillary blood, the alveolar capillary interface consists of 6 layers. In the alveolar region, we come across a monomolecular layer of surfactant which spreads over the surface of the alveoli. The next is a thin layer of fluid which lines the alveoli. The third layer is composed of alveolar epithelial cells, which are the thin epithelial cells lining the alveolus. In the region between alveoli and capillary, there is the fourth layer, namely the interstitial space. In the capillary region, we have the fifth and sixth layers, which are the basement membrane of capillaries and the capillary endothelial cells. The respiratory membrane is about 0.1 microns thick with a total surface area of about 70 square meters. The average diameter of the pulmonary capillaries is only 8 microns, and red blood cells are in close contact with the capillary membrane. This facilitates the easy exchange of gases between blood and alveoli. However, in reality, oxygen from hemoglobin molecule in the red cells of the capillaries enter into the alveolar lumen and pass through 10 layers, namely alveolar surfactant, epithelial cells, basement membrane, interstitial fluid, basement membrane of capillary endothelium, layer of endothelial cells, plasma, red cell membrane, intraerythrocyte fluid, and finally the hemoglobin molecule. Now, in order to understand the movement of gases clearly, we should understand the term diffusing capacity. Diffusing capacity is the volume of gas which diffuses through the capillary membrane per minute for a pressure gradient of 1 millimeter of mercury. For oxygen, the diffusing capacity is 21 milliliters per minute per 1 millimeter of mercury, and for carbon dioxide it is 400 milliliters per minute per 1 millimeter of mercury. Thus, the diffusing capacity of carbon dioxide is 20 times higher than that of oxygen, and hence exchange takes place through bulk flow diffusion. Diffusion is not an absolute phenomenon. It is affected by several factors such as pressure gradient, solubility of gas in fluid medium, total surface area of the respiratory membrane, molecular weight of the gas, and thickness of respiratory membrane. Now, let us see each factor in detail. The pressure gradient is the difference between the partial pressure of gas in the alveoli and pulmonary capillary blood. It has a direct bearing on diffusion capacity, that is, diffusing capacity dC is directly proportional to the pressure gradient Pg. Secondly, diffusing capacity is directly related to solubility S of the gas. If the solubility of a gas is more in the fluid medium, more number of molecules are available for diffusion and the diffusing capacity increases. Thirdly, diffusing capacity of the gas is directly related to the surface area A of the membrane. If the total surface area of the respiratory membrane is low, the diffusing capacity of gases is also decreased and vice versa. Fourthly, diffusing capacity is inversely proportional to the molecular weight mW of the gas. If the molecular weight is more, the density is more and the rate of diffusion is less. Next is the thickness of the respiratory membrane. Diffusion is inversely related to the thickness T of the respiratory membrane. That is, more the thickness, less diffusion, as in fibrous edema. Thus, the relation between diffusing capacity and the factors affecting it can be expressed as dC is directly related to Pg into S into A over mW into T, where dC is diffusing capacity, Pg is pressure gradient, S is solubility of the gas, A is the surface area of the respiratory membrane, mW is the molecular weight, and T is the thickness of the respiratory membrane. Now that we have comprehended what is diffusion capacity, the factors affecting it, and the relationship between them, let us understand actual diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The diffusion of oxygen takes place from atmosphere to alveoli. This occurs because of the pressure gradient, that is, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is 159 millimeters of mercury and the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is 104 millimeters of mercury. Thus, the pressure gradient or difference of 55 millimeters of mercury drives the oxygen from the atmosphere to enter the alveolus. Next is the diffusion from the alveoli to the blood. The partial pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary capillary is 40 millimeters of mercury and in the alveoli it is 104 millimeters of mercury. A pressure gradient of 64 millimeters of mercury facilitates the easy diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to blood. In venous blood, the volume of oxygen is 14 milliliters per dl, and in arterial blood it is 19 milliliter percent. The diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to blood is thus 5 milliliters per dl of blood. Now, let us see how carbon dioxide moves or diffuses from the body to the atmosphere. From blood to alveoli, the movement of carbon dioxide is propelled by the pressure and concentration gradients. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is 40 millimeters of mercury and in the blood is 45 millimeters of mercury. This pressure gradient or difference of 5 millimeters of mercury drives diffusion of carbon dioxide from blood to alveoli. Coming to the volume diffused, the concentration of carbon dioxide in venous blood is 52 milliliter percent and in arterial blood is 48 milliliter percent. Hence, the volume of carbon dioxide diffused from blood to alveoli is 4 milliliter per dl of blood. Similarly, from alveoli to atmosphere, the diffusion is very easy because in the atmosphere the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is only 0.3 millimeters of mercury, while in the alveoli it is 40 millimeters of mercury. So, carbon dioxide diffuses out of the alveoli easily. At the tissue level, there is diffusion of oxygen from blood into tissues. The partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood is 95 millimeters of mercury. This is because of the admixture of venous blood by 2% shunt flow. Now, do you understand the term shunt flow? Shunt flow is the small fraction of blood which reaches the heart without being oxygenated. The average oxygen tension in the tissues is 40 millimeters of mercury. Thus, there is a pressure gradient of about 55 millimeters of mercury by which oxygen easily diffuses into the tissues. The content of oxygen in arterial blood is 19 milliliter percent and 14 milliliter percent in venous blood. Thus, 5 milliliters per dl of oxygen is diffused into tissues. Now, let us see the diffusion of carbon dioxide from the tissues into blood. Since there is incessant metabolic activity in the body, carbon dioxide is constantly produced in the cells. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 46 millimeters of mercury, and that in arterial blood is 40 millimeters of mercury with a pressure gradient of 6 millimeters of mercury. This causes diffusion of carbon dioxide from tissues to blood. You can see the events in the diagram. The diffusion of carbon dioxide from tissues to blood is 4 milliliters per dl because the gradient between carbon dioxide content in venous blood 52 milliliter percent and arterial blood 48 milliliter percent. Next, we will define two important terms: respiratory exchange ratio RER and respiratory quotient RQ. The respiratory exchange ratio is the ratio between the net output of carbon dioxide from the tissues to the simultaneous net uptake of oxygen by the tissues. That is, RER is equal to carbon dioxide output over oxygen uptake. The value of RER depends upon the metabolic activity. Let me explain. When a person is on a carbohydrate diet, the RER value is 1 because the amount of carbon dioxide produced during metabolic activity is the same as the amount of oxygen consumed. A fat diet decreases RER to a value of 0.7 and a protein diet increases it slightly to about 0.803. On a balanced diet, when an optimal quantity of proteins, carbohydrates and fats are utilized, the RER value is about 0.825. Now, we move on to the final aspect of this module to define the respiratory quotient. Since This would assess the efficiency of respiration. The next question is, what is respiratory quotient? The molar ratio of carbon dioxide produced to oxygen consumed is called the respiratory quotient. At about 1 hour after a meal, the RQ is 1, since at this stage only carbohydrates are utilized by the tissues. In the next stage, fat is used where the RQ decreases to 7 and finally to 0.8 when proteins are utilized. The respiratory quotient increases during exercise, so to say, exercise can increase the efficiency of respiration, that is, greater volumes of carbon dioxide are expelled for less volume of oxygen utilized. In conclusion, we can say the exchange of respiratory gases is thus the process of movement of oxygen from the alveoli to the capillary blood and movement of carbon dioxide from blood into alveoli in response to partial pressures and concentration gradients of the gases through the layers of the respiratory membrane. Thank you.